Thank you. Thank you very much. Um, Meanwhile, I'm glad to see such an international gathering being present at this conference. And so I would like to begin my talk directly. Um, and as you gather, um, I'm an emeritus professor from Cardiff University. And the title of my presentation is Forest Preservation and the Climate Crisis. Our planet has been undergoing extensive losses of biodiversity over the last 50 years. Could we please have the next slide? Thank you. The Worldwide Fund for Nature reports that the current rate of species extinction is between 1,000 and 10,000 times higher than natural extinction rates. WWF 2022. Alongside losses of wetlands and coral reefs, deforestation has been one of the main factors involved. Causes include burgeoning greenhouse gas emissions, agricultural expansion, misplaced mineral exploitation and the associated construction of roads and other infrastructure, and also misguided forms of forestry, including the clear cutting of forest as shown on this slide. These have been among the more prominent of the sources both of species loss and of large reductions of populations that have taken place among the species that remain and survive. Severe as these trends may seem, the accompanying threats to regional systems suggest that they may be more severe still. Could we have the next slide, please? Could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. There is a danger that such regional systems as the Amazon rainforest could reach their tipping points. This slide is about tipping points with their rainforest, with this rainforest, the Amazon rainforest, morphing into a savanna. Tipping points have been defined by IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in the following manner. Under critical stress, systems, quote, become increasingly likely to reach a critical threshold beyond which a system reorganizes, often abruptly and or irreversibly. This is from their report of 2021, cited by Julian Caldicott in a paper of 2022. The critical stress being contributed by global heating. Other regional systems are also at risk, including temperate forests and boreal forests, as well as ice shields such as the West Antarctic ice shield. There is a related danger that any one system reaching its tipping point could trigger a domino effect among several others, Caldicott 2022. Several regions of forest are included among the systems at risk, including other tropical forests, such as those of West Africa, Central Africa, of Sumatra, and of Borneo, temperate forests, such as those of the American Northwest, and the important boreal forests, such as those of Canada, Scandinavia, and Siberia. Boreal forests store between 30% and 40% of the entire planet's land-based carbon. Yet an area of boreal forest the size of the state of Kentucky was removed through industrial logging just during the 20 years up to 2017. See my 2024 book, page 39. Could we have the next slide, please? Preserving the forests of our planet thus turns out to be an ethical imperative. It is vital for their human and non-human inhabitants. We can see a picture of one of those. It is vital for future human generations, who would otherwise be deprived of the opportunity to visit and enjoy them, to study them, and to benefit from their medicinal and nutritional potential. And it is also vital for the preservation of the planetary system of regional systems, which turns out to be far more vulnerable than we might have supposed in view of the longevity of most of these forests. The planetary system is itself a vital interest of all human beings of all foreseeable generations, and there again, of the future generations of the non-human species with which we share our planet. They too, we hope, will have future generations. But while most ethicists have little hesitation in recognizing the moral standing of sentient animals, and even that of non-sentient ones possessed of purposiveness displayed through their mobility, we cannot safely assume that vegetable species lack such standing. These species having a good of their own has been well illustrated in Peter Wohleben's 2017 book, The Hidden Life of Trees, What They Feel, How They Communicate. And Kenneth Goodpaster has argued impressively in an article entitled On Being Morally Considerable, back in 1978, for the view that whatever has a good of its own must be recognized as having moral standing, for which he employed the synonymous term moral considerability. Moral standing means that whatever has moral standing should be taken into account in moral decision making. And if moral standing belongs to contemporary trees, so it also plausibly does to their future generations as well. Next slide, please. This does not mean that it is always wrong to derive supplies of timber or of produce such as thatch or Brazil nuts from our forests. For there are ways of managing forests sustainably so that whatever is extracted is made up for by regrowth, or as in the case of Brazil nuts, by the next year's harvest. One policy for foresters, which depends on this basis, is that of maximum sustainable yield, which advocates extracting as much as is compatible with regrowth and recovery, so that comparable harvests are available for every human generation. Policies of this kind, however, need to be modified, as in this slide, to ensure that the extraction of timber does not involve the extinction of any species, whether globally or locally. This is partly because each species may easily be needed by future human generations, partly because of the interests of the non-human inhabitants of the forest, and partly because each and every species is likely to contribute to the sustainability of its own biological community. A further ground is the good of the members of the species in question, whether those of the current generation or those of future generations, whose very existence would be endangered if harvesting from forests were to be maximised. Next slide, please. Yet a further ground is the well-being of the indigenous communities who inhabit one or other of the world's forests, such as the Yanomami of Brazil. An excellent book about the indigenous peoples of the Amazon rainforest is Out of the Amazon by Sue Cunningham and Gillian T. Prance of the Royal Botanical Gardens, Kew, London, and published in 1992 by Her Majesty's Stationery Office. It is often the indigenous peoples who are aware of the medicinal benefits of the plants of the forests. But it is just as important that they inherit a traditional understanding of how to live sustainably with the forest and are adept at preserving the forest. They, in turn, are dependent on the forest, and their entire way of life would be undermined if their forests were to dry up or to reach a tipping point and to become, say, a savanna. It is worth adding that the indigenous knowledge of forest peoples can contribute to the preservation of forests alongside the findings of modern science. While neither of these systems of thought has a monopoly of knowledge or is likely to understand in full the needs of forest creatures, it is all the clearer that neither of them has all the answers and that their findings need to be pressed into service in a complementary manner. A further example of a people with indigenous knowledge of the forests in which they live can be found in the Oromo of southwest Ethiopia, where the Borana Oromo have a traditional system of water preservation and sharing, and of the related skills that keep this system in operation. Details of this form of traditional knowledge can be found in the work of Professor Walkine Kelbesa, nowadays a professor at Addis Ababa University, who writes widely about Indigenous knowledge. I was the supervisor of his doctorate at Cardiff University. Thus, the well-being of Indigenous peoples is a direct ground for the preservation of forests, and their Indigenous knowledge deserves respect, partly because of its instrumental value for anyone seeking to preserve the relevant forests, and partly because of the non-instrumental value present in viable traditional cultures. In both cases, reasons are to be found for the preservation of forests, because all kinds of value comprise reasons for action, and the continuation of these forests is necessary if these kinds of value are to be preserved. Next slide, please. It might seem the case that it might seem that the case I'm presenting is antithetical to all phenomena that destroy forests, whether permanently or temporarily. But I should make it clear at this point that my view is that lightning strikes and forest fires need to be accepted to some degree as parts of natural cycles, necessary in some cases for the germination of the seeds of certain species. However, what is unacceptable and in principle intolerable is these lightning strikes and forest fires becoming far more frequent and wider ranging than they used to be in the past, as has been witnessed again this year. For higher temperatures and higher humidity generate greater frequencies and wider ranges of lightning strikes. Thus, the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions is required to contain this problem, and if possible, to reduce the increased frequency both of thunderstorms, of lightning strikes, and of forest fires, alongside a reduction of deforestation. This recognition introduces the importance and urgency of climate mitigation, for which one of many reasons is that it is needed for the preservation of forests of all kinds. Next slide, please. Thus, in view of the likely causes of biodiversity loss in forests mentioned earlier, one crucial component of solutions to this problem consists in efforts to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and to agree to observe global limits to such emissions. Currently, there are agreements in place deriving from the Paris Climate Conference of 2015, but the agreements are perforce based in what are called nationally determined contributions, and so far, the offers of the various countries turn out, when aggregated, to permit far more greenhouse gases to be emitted than is compatible with the agreed ceiling on average temperature increases above pre-industrial levels of 1.5 degrees. Accordingly, if there is to be effective climate mitigation, the nationally determined contributions need to be significantly ratcheted up so as to make that target attainable, or if it cannot be attained, then to minimize the extent to which it is overshot. And that is going to be discussed at the COP29 conference of this November. All this involves many changes to industry and society, such as the full introduction of sustainable energy generation, reductions of petrol-powered air journeys and car journeys, replacement of blast furnaces by greener forms of iron and steel production, greater reliance on public transport, the introduction of air pump heating, and more. Other needed changes include changing patterns of agriculture to avoid further bulldozing of forests intended to replace them with crops such as palm oil or pineapples, and changing patterns of industry so as to avoid the extraction of gas and oil from beneath forests, the construction of aluminium smelters there, and the construction of network of roads to supply these various forms of industry. Next slide, please. Foresters too need to contribute to forest preservation by abandoning policies of clear-cutting forests or even sections of them, and moving to policies of sustainable extraction instead. In particular, mature forests should be allowed to become old-growth forests, and old-growth forests should be exempted from clear-cutting. As Cassie Steiner of the Sierra Club Wisconsin chapter writes, in Wisconsin, the Chickamauga-Nicolet National Forest is a beautiful staple of the area. Its tree-lined roads and scenic lakes are cherished by many. Its old-growth trees, including a 368-year-old cathedral pine, are really important for biodiversity, carbon storage, soil health, clean water, and so much more. But there are plans to clear-cut a large section of old growth in the National Forest, destroying these beautiful old trees, end of quotation. Such clear-cutting needs to be curtailed. Next slide, please. Nevertheless, further measures that would contribute more directly to the preservation of forests appear to be needed. At the Kunming Montreal Biodiversity Conference of 2022, it was agreed to fund and establish maritime reserves amounting to 30% of the oceans and terrestrial reserves amounting to 30% of continents, which would be declared zones of no extraction, whether through fishing or through the mining of minerals. The effectiveness of agreements of this character depends, of course, on whether the signatories actually pay the amounts they have agreed, and whether this is done remains to be seen. Yet this agreement paves the way for parallel agreements about forest reserves, which could prohibit extraction of all kinds from agreed areas. Further reserves that could similarly be designated as such include selected wetlands and coral reefs. The designation of areas as reserves would be likely to preserve the species living in those reserves, alongside policies of responsible forestry and responsible fishing. A key aspect of responsible forestry is the preservation, or where necessary, the initiation of connectivity. Could we have the next slide, please? For many species, both animal and vegetable, need continuous forest cover to be maintained for their survival to be guaranteed. In North Borneo, part of Malaysia, for example, there are laws against cutting down forests for the sake of inaugurating plantations, for cutting down forests right up to the edge of rivers, but these laws are often disregarded. In circumstances such as these, it is vital to preserve or to restore forest cover along the banks of rivers, so that bodies of forest are connected or reconnected, and so that riparian stretches of forest can serve as highways for the relevant species, thus restoring for them a much greater range of territory and allowing much healthier patterns of nutrition and indeed of reproduction, as well as much better access to rivers. Another part of the solution is to focus tree planting, for example, when performed to offset air travel, to focus it on places where forests are at risk and where planting can make them more sustainable. Where trees are planted cannot be regarded as a matter of indifference. Planting where forests are at risk and in ways that make them more sustainable could help preserve the forests in question, whether tropical, temperate, or boreal. The slide looks like, well, boreal. Preserve them from approaching their tipping points, and thus contribute to the preservation of the regional systems of our planet, including forests that are vital for the preservation of life on Earth. For there are measures and policies whose implementation could do much to preserve our forests, to the great benefit of the vast majority of all living creatures on our planet. Some of these can be delivered by individuals, households, or local communities, while others require decision-making by local authorities, by companies, or by national governments. National governments can take action in some cases through the policies of their departments of forestry, and in others through the regulation of the activities of agricultural, forestry-related, and industrial activities, and by dedicating adequate funding to making all this possible. Next slide, please. Another measure, less expensive but at least equally decisive, would consist in supporting international legislation to criminalize ecocide. That is, consciously taking actions liable to cause significant environmental damage of either a long-lasting or a widespread character. This can be done by amending the Statute of Rome and making ecocide an international crime alongside genocide, aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Such an amendment requires no more than the support of 2/3 of the 123 signatory countries to the Statute of Rome, and would then be enforced by the International Criminal Court. Such a measure could well be the most significant step that most governments could achieve as part of their policies of climate mitigation and of the promotion of sustainability. And the deterrent effect of its introduction could do a great deal to preserve our forests at a stroke. I would like to insert here the fact that apparently such an amendment has actually been proposed very recently by Vanuatu, Fiji, and Samoa for consideration at the December meeting of the signatories of the Statute of Rome. Ecocide is introduced at greater detail in my new book, The Ethics of the Climate Crisis, which I'm holding up. Could I have the next slide, please? This book, in fact, concerns more crises than one. It first depicts the science of the climate crisis, explaining the science of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in reader-friendly prose, but then goes on to present the related but distinct crisis of biodiversity loss. This is the chapter where issues about forests are presented in some detail, but room is also found to introduce the further crisis of air pollution. All of these crises are found to have overlapping causes and therefore related potential remedies. There follow, in the book, 2 chapters on ethical issues, which is where the relation of ethics to well-being, both human and non-human, is explained, and also the importance of bearing in mind future generations and of adopting sustainable systems so as to make it possible to provide both for current and for future interests on an ongoing basis. This chapter also explains the importance of planting trees in such a way as to strengthen regional systems and to prevent them reaching their tipping points. The second ethics chapter concerns the victims of climate injustice, including non-human victims, and the different policies that are indicated if one's ethical stance is biocentric, taking all living creatures into account, that is my own stance, rather than anthropocentric. It also considers the shape of climate justice, explaining that the claim that polluters must be the ones who pay for climate mitigation and adaptation, plausible as it may seem, does not altogether work, since many relevant individual polluters are dead and many polluting states have ceased to exist, and concludes that all states with the ability to pay should contribute to these global efforts, in view of this being in the interests of all. The chapter on political solutions that follows considers what to do when nations other than one's own default on climate agreements. It also presents several changes that could beneficially be made, one of which was actually implemented by the British government in the interlude between the book being sent to the publishers, Polity Press, and publication in late April 2024. This, in fact, is the chapter in which ecocide receives in-depth treatment. Next slide, please. The final chapter concerns obstacles to climate and biodiversity action, obstacles such as despair and apathy, arguing that there are sufficient grounds for hope to persevere with collaborative action. It also considers obstacles that colonize people's heads, such as the so-called realist theory of society in general and international relations in particular, the theory that everyone always acts out of self-interest. This theory, or rather assumption, means that no one else can be trusted, as they will break their word as soon as it suits them. But it also conflicts with the facts, such as that at COP28 and COP29, a loss and damage fund was both agreed, launched, and funded to pay poor countries to remedy harms resulting from climate change. And such as the agreement at the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Conference mentioned earlier, making 30% of the oceans into maritime reserves where no fishing or other forms of extraction are allowed. Could we have the last slide, please? If we manage to discard such so-called realist assumptions, we may manage to attain international collaboration, not least in matters of biodiversity conservation, such as the preservation of forests. Thank you for listening. That is where I finish. I noticed that there was a trade in contributions to the chat, but I wasn't able to discover what they were. And so if there were any questions there, that would be interesting. But I'm now available for answering any questions that they may be.
Yes, doctor, that's a great presentation. I'll share your email ID in the chat box. If anyone have a questions, they will contact you through the mail. Any questions for doctor? Okay, doctor, thanks for the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll move to the next presentation.